Hello everyone, I have a real treat for you this time. In this video, we're going to explore a very popular Skyrim mystery, who built the Skyforge and why. I started dwelling on this topic because the Epic Nate did a video about this a few months back, and he really hit it out of the park. In case you somehow don't know who the Epic Nate is, he's a legendary YouTuber who has covered nearly every Fallout and Elder Scrolls mystery there is, and he's someone I look up to a whole lot. Really, it's Nate and Camel, who runs Camelworks, that are essentially my idols. They're a huge part of what inspired me to become a YouTuber and try my hand at solving Bethesda's mysteries as well. So the Epic Nate unraveled the Skyforge a few months back, and I agree with most of what he presented. Also, in my extended research on the subject, I've come across a few fan theories with similar ideas that I also believe to be more or less correct. However, there's a key path that for whatever reason no one, including Nate, has explored, and it adds a whole new dimension to Bethesda's vision for the Skyforge. So here's what I'm going to do in this video. First, I'll cover the basic principles of thought behind the Skyforge that are essential to understanding it, but when it comes to the things that the Epic Nate also covered, I won't go into quite as much detail as he did, because why do that when I could just tag his video in the top right there. I highly recommend that you watch it, and I'll also link it in the description. So after I give you a rundown of the Skyforge, I'll explore the path that for some reason no one else seems to see, which will lead us to a big secret about Bethesda's vision for just what this thing is. Let's start with the practical question of just what this thing is in the game. It's a huge forge with a large statue of some sort of bird sitting on top of it, almost as if it's nesting. And its eyes start glowing around dusk and continue glowing until the morning. What kind of bird is this? Well, it's obviously based on some sort of raptor, so an eagle, hawk, falcon, something like that. The forge is used by Yorland Greymane, whose family has been smithing weapons and armor here for generations. As the player proceeds through the companion's questline, it becomes apparent that the Skyforge has magical properties, which allow it to craft specialty items. There's also a little cave beneath the forge called the Underforge. The inner circle within the companions uses this place to conduct their exclusive practices. Now let's hit the books and see what we can find out about the Skyforge. The earliest account of it comes from Songs of the Return Volume 7, during the 500 Companions' conquest of Skyrim. The crew of the Jorrvaskr was sailing up the White River and eventually arrived at what they called the Winged Colossus. They learned from their captive snow elves that it predates even their existence, and for some reason the snow elves fear it. So how old is this thing exactly? Well, let's keep reading. Some remnant of the gods' efforts to render a paradise in Mundus before the shattering of Shor. So we're talking sometime between the creation of Mundus and the shattering of Shor, also known as Lorkhan. This period of Elder Scrolls lore is a very loaded subject, so let's just slow down here a little bit. There are many different tales of the Dawn era and early Merethic era, some of which can fit together and others simply cannot. And on top of that, the order of events is often disputed. So the result is that every Elder Scrolls superfan kinda has their own headcanon for what really happened throughout this period of Elder Scrolls history. So for the past few weeks, I have been rereading all of the sources in attempts to complete my headcanon, and I'm very pleased with the account that I put together. To tell you a bit about my approach when it comes to subjects of this nature, well folks, my first and foremost source that I stick to more than anything when I do videos like this is what we can and do experience when we play the games. The main question I ask is, can I trace what's being said here to something within the games? And of course that's never enough, because there isn't a text for everything, so I also have to start with in-game evidence and think outward from there, and sometimes I have to just use my head. Nothing like good old powers of reason, am I right? So now I'm going to tell you the parts of my account of this period of Elder Scrolls lore that are important to understanding the Skyforge. So let's begin. The original two gods of the Elder Scrolls universe are Anu and Padome, though they may have been more of divine forces rather than beings. These two forces created another set of forces that were closer to what we might call beings, and they are called the Etata. Sources vary on why exactly Anu and Padome created these Etata, but for our purposes it doesn't matter. Eventually, one of the Etata, Lorkhan, who is often called Shor in Skyrim, came up with the idea to create Mundus, the mortal realm. No one really knows why Lorkhan wanted to create Mundus, and that is the main source of the numerous religious conflicts within the Elder Scrolls series. What we do know is that Mundus was created by Lorkhan and some of the other Atata, and somewhere along the line, Lorkhan and another Atata, Kine, or sometimes called Kynareth, got married. Also, some of the Atata didn't like Lorkhan's idea, so they decided to make their own realm, Oblivion. And so the Atata that chose to take part in the creation of Mundus began their work. I like to imagine that this worked a lot like how video game development does. This was fun for a while, but then the Atata started to notice something. There was a price for everything that they created. With every creation, they lost a bit of their divine energy. Once the Atata came to this realization, Auriel, also known as Akatosh, called for a convention at Adamantine Tower. In modern Elder Scrolls, this structure is more commonly called Dureni Tower, and it now resides on the Isle of Balfiera in the Iliac Bay. However, I do not believe that it was here at this time. So here's why. Back in 2005, Michael Kirkbride, whose works are a huge part of Elder Scrolls lore, was asked about extraterrestrial beings in the Elder Scrolls universe. And here's what he had to say. Read the Dureni Tower section in the Pocket Guide to the Empire very carefully. There's been a rocket ship in High Rock since we wrote the Pocket Guide to the Empire. And if we take a look at the section that he's referring to, we can find a curious line. Although it has been much modified and added onto over the years, its core is a smooth cylinder of shining metal. So apparently Kirkbride's intention here is that the core structure of the tower is some sort of spacecraft. Despite being a huge part of the series, he is not the arbiter of Elder Scrolls canon, but I do think that there is truth to this because it's alluded to again in ESO in this text called Once. To be clear, I don't think that we're talking about a literal rocket ship here. I think that Bethesda probably decided on something that makes a bit more sense in this universe, but also remains true to what Kirkbride wrote. And that would be something like Dwemer technology. So yeah, I think that the convention was held in Adamantine Tower, which at the time was a spaceship that worked kinda like how Dwemer technology does. So this convention was essentially a trial for Lorkhan. Since creating Mundus was his idea, some Atata felt that it was his fault and they had become weakened. Some even thought that he had tricked them into doing this because he wanted to weaken them. So they had this convention to get to the bottom of this and to figure out if Lorkhan should be punished. In the end, Auriel sentenced Lorkhan to death, so Trinimac ripped Lorkhan apart. Most of his body became Nirn's two moons, Massor and Secunda. Some parts fell to Nirn and eventually became ebony deposits. However, Lorkhan's heart could not be destroyed, so Auriel tied it to an arrow and fired it away. The island of Vardenfell sprang up where it landed. Some of the Atata had retained enough of their divinity to remain immortal, and they became the original Aedra. But many Atata transformed into new things, such as the Earthbones, possibly dragons, and the first race of mortals, the Elnathae. The sources that are more detailed on this subject consistently claim that this transformation was voluntary, but some sources loosely imply that the common belief among humans is that the Elnathae were simply creations of the Atata and were never divine themselves. But I haven't found a source that tells an actual story explaining why humans believe this. I made sure to pursue this because one could argue that the sources that claim that the Elnathae were Atata are biased because they are Elven. However, since I can't find a source that directly contradicts the claim that the Elnathae started as Atata, I'm inclined to think that they did. So whether it was by choice or simply the result of losing their divinity, many Atata became Elnathae. And being mortal presented them with a transportation issue. They had to get from the Adamantine Tower in space to Nirn. So how did they get there? Well, I think I've actually figured this out by cross-referencing a few things, which are this spaceship idea, the Annuad, and the section on the Isle of Balfiera in the Pocket Guide to the Empire. The Elnathae end up separated throughout Nirn, and the verb used here is landed. Also, Adamantine Tower apparently protrudes very deep into Nirn's surface. So what makes all of these things make sense? Well, I think they started by doing something practical. They flew the rocket towards Nirn, but it was never designed to be landed, so eventually they realized that they were going to crash. And remember, they had never experienced being mortal before, so they thought, wait, can we survive something like that? I don't know. So they took another practical step. They jumped. They must have improvised ways to survive the fall, like maybe makeshift escape pods or some sort of slow fall spell, something like that. Some Elnathae landed together, so maybe they locked arms or all got in the same escape pod, something of that nature. This group is called the Old Elnathae, and they built a society in what became Aldmeris. Other Elnathay landed all over the place and adopted a nomadic lifestyle. They are called the Wandering Elnathay. Adamantine Tower flew straight into Nirn and went deep into the surface. It's still right where it crashed now, but the original structure is covered. Eventually, war broke out between these two groups. Fans often refer to this period as the Elnathay Wars, but in the lore I've only ever seen it called the War of Manifest Metaphors. The only source that offers any explanation as to why they went to war is the Anuad. It claims that the Wandering Elnathay eventually found the old Elnathay civilization and were refused entry, which resulted in hurt feelings. Now that I've reached this point, I need to explain something that I've taken to calling the convention problem. There's something I have not yet mentioned about the War of Manifest Metaphors. It is commonly accepted that Lorkhan fought alongside the Wandering Elnathay. So, we now have an issue here. If Lorkhan was executed at the convention, then how is he alive during the War of Manifest Metaphors? This is the issue that stumps everyone that tries to understand this period of Elder Scrolls lore. Some fans suggest that we have the order of events wrong, and that Lorkhan was captured during the war, thus ending it, and then he was tried and executed at the convention afterward. This is what the Epic Nate seems to suggest in his video about the Skyforge, and I was on board with this at first, but I haven't found a single primary source that suggests that order of events. Furthermore, the sources are very consistent in claiming that the Elnathay did not exist prior to the convention, and putting the war before the convention would also put the Elnathay's existence beforehand as well, and I haven't found a single source that suggests that is the case. The closest thing is the Anuad, which has no convention, which I believe to simply be incorrect. Another direction some fans go in is that maybe one of these things is false, as in either Lorkhan was not executed at the convention or he was not alive for the war. I find the latter very unlikely because my first and foremost source when I do mystery videos is what we can and do experience when we play the games, and Ariel's bow and shield exist in the games, and Gelebor says that legend holds that Ariel aka Akatosh carried the bow against the forces of Lorkhan in ancient and mythic times. I also find it unlikely that he was not executed at the convention because the only source that goes into detail about this event is Before the Ages of Man, and it says that this indeed took place at the tower. So somehow both these things are true. I won't go into detail here, but in essence what I think happened is Lorkhan survived the execution. So the outcome of the convention was that the Aedra formed two sides. One under Ariel, whose goal was to hunt down and kill Lorkhan. Let's call them the Anti-Creationists. The other side formed under Lorkhan, and their goal was to defeat the Anti-Creationists, thus saving Lorkhan, and to continue enjoying life in Mundus. Let's call them the Pro-Creationists. And guess what? Eventually this conflict between the Aedra merged with this conflict between the two groups of Elnathay. The old Elnathay joined the Anti-Creationists, and the Wandering Elnathay joined the Pro-Creationists. Why exactly it panned out this way is never made clear in the lore, but from what I've gathered it must have been the enemy of my enemy is my friend sort of deal. Because if it were simply based on their stances on creation, then I find it unlikely that every single Wandering Elnathay independently sided with Lorkhan. Unlike the old Elnathay, they were not a unified society, they were just individual nomads. So for every single one of them to have picked the same side, there must have been more at work than simply their thoughts on creation. That's why I think the Anuad is right when it tells of the Wanderers being refused entry into the old Elnathay society, because it creates a pre-existing conflict between them that can result in them each looking for allies. Thus, they joined forces with the Aedra and the War of Manifest Metaphors was fought. The subsequent destruction reshaped Nirn into the place that we know from the games. In the end, Lorkhan was defeated, and this time around I believe it was Ariel that killed him. The Aedra and Elnathay that fought alongside Lorkhan, such as Kyne, do not seem to have been punished for doing so. At this point, regardless of what side they had all picked, they simply had to embrace creation. Some believe the remaining Aedra are still somewhere in Mundus, and others think that they made it back to Aetherius. The old Elnathay continued living on Aldmeris and eventually became the first mayor, and thus are the ancient ancestors of the elves that we know from the games. The Wandering Elnathay ended up scattered on the continents of Atmora, Yakuta, and Akavir. They became the first men and are the ancient ancestors of the men that we know from the games. So what does all that have to do with the Skyforge? Well, let's take another look at that passage from Songs of the Return Volume 7. Considering everything we just talked about, this is now starting to make some sense, isn't it? The captive snow elves are saying that this large stone bird existed before they did, and they fear it. But why? Well, what is this thing that they fear? It's a giant stone bird, seemingly something like an eagle or a hawk. Creatures of this nature are largely associated with Kyne. And this region of Skyrim, Whiterun, is heavily associated with Kyne as well. So, assuming that the Skyforge has something to do with Kyne, it makes perfect sense that the Snow Elves fear it, because they are descendants of the old Elnathay, who were Kyne's enemies during the War of Manifest Metaphors. So their culture has inherited this fear and resentment for Kyne. To reinforce this a bit more, there's actually another forge we need to talk about, the Lunar Forge. Just a short jaunt away from Whiterun and the Skyforge, there's a structure nestled into the mountainside called Silent Moon's Camp. And at the top, there's a rounded building with an opening in the middle that contains the Lunar Forge. If you look around, you'll also find some weapons with a unique enchantment called Silent Moon's Enchant that causes the weapons to do extra damage when the moons are out. Weapons with the enchantment can't actually be crafted directly from the forge. The enchantment has to be added at an enchanting station, but in this journal, Notes on the Lunar Forge, the author states that the weapons were clearly forged there. Which really is Bethesda telling us that yes, there is a connection between this location and the enchantment. So what does this matter to us? Well, since the moons are part of Lorkhan's body, this power seems to be related to Lorkhan, Kyne's husband. So, given that there's another unique forge very nearby to the Skyforge that seems related to Kyne's husband, it seems like we're on the right track here. Now let's talk a bit more about the Skyforge's magical properties. Near the end of the Companions questline, a funeral is held for the Harbinger of the Companions, Kodlak Whitemane, and he is cremated in the Skyforge. Later on, Yorland Greymane will offer this dialogue.
You know, since Kodlak's funeral, the Skyforge feels more awake. It's always been said that the souls of the heroes of old are what gives Skyforge steel its strength. But I think the Forge knows the greatness of Kodlak's soul. I can't really explain, but it feels like it's young. I'll wager it could now forge metal the likes of which hasn't been seen since eras long forgotten. I'm eager to try.
Sure enough, the player will discover that the Skyforge is now capable of crafting Nord hero weapons and ancient Nord armor. So somehow performing cremations in the Skyforge gives it power. Yorland thinks there might be something unique about Kodlak's soul as well, but I'm not reading into that too much because in the games it's well established that individual souls have various values based on the number of things. So yeah, maybe Kodlak has a great soul, or maybe it's just the first funeral they've had here in a long time. It doesn't really matter. Now let's discuss the Underforge. As you know, if you've played the Companions questline, there is a little room under the Skyforge that the Companions call the Underforge. This is where the Circle conducts any practices related to being werewolves and following the Daedric Prince Hircine. When it's time for the player to become a werewolf, Skjor will offer this dialogue about the Underforge.
Here's all you need to know. Jorrvaskr is the oldest building in Whiterun. The Skyforge was here long before it was. And the Underforge taps an ancient magic that is older than men or elves.
It's not clear exactly what magic he's referring to. Nothing stands out about the Underforge beyond that it's where the Circle conducts any werewolf or otherwise Hircine-related business. And the only reason we have to believe that this location is a key factor in that is that line of Skjor's. Yes, this is where the player becomes a werewolf, but if we cure ourselves and decide to become one again, Aela can make it happen wherever. Also, put more simply, we know from the games that people get lycanthropy outside of this cave. Another thing to note is that after initially becoming a werewolf, the player must still be one in order to enter the Underforge again. From that, someone might assume that only lycanthropes can enter, however the player isn't a lycanthrope when they enter the first time, and Yorland is able to enter here. So this seems to just be a role-playing decision that Bethesda made rather than a clue. So what are these magics? Bethesda would not write this dialogue without intent. There must be more to the Underforge than meets the eye. So I have some guesses as to what these magics that the Underforge taps into might do. Perhaps these magics are what allows the Circle to craft wolf armor. Maybe praying to Hircine down here allows Yorland to craft it up top, or maybe it works like the Atronach Forge and Hircine just sends it over. Also, from the games we know that lycanthropy is not always well controlled, but the companions have no issues controlling their beast forms. So maybe something about contracting lycanthropy in the Underforge allows them to better control their beast forms, and may even make them more powerful than average werewolves. So in summary, what's important about the Underforge for our purposes is that it seems to be Hircine's place now and may not be directly related to what's going on with Kyne and the Skyforge topside. But it is curious that something tied to Kyne is sitting on top of something tied to Hircine. I've long wondered if there's some sort of relationship between Kyne and Hircine, because one could easily interpret Hircine to be a direct enemy to Kyne. Think about it, Kyne represents the beauty of nature, and Hircine represents the dark side of it. His theme, in essence, is the perversion and exploitation of her theme. So just a thought that maybe there's more to the relationship between these two beings than meets the eye. Now it's time to talk about the unexplored avenue that I mentioned in the beginning. At this point, we're pretty sure that the Skyforge has something to do with Kyne, otherwise known as Kynareth. So is it a coincidence that it happens to be in the same city as the Temple of Kynareth? I don't think so. The temple is really a very minor place in the game, but it does have a quest associated with it, Blessings of Nature. Apparently, lightning struck the Gildergreen, the large tree decorating the Wind District. And to restore it to its former beauty, the player must retrieve some sap from the Eldergleam, a similar tree that resides underground in Eastmarch. However, there's actually another way to complete this quest that many players never discover due to it being unmarked. If you stop in the temple before departing for Eldergleam Sanctuary, a man named Maurice Jondrel will approach you. He states that he wants to visit Eldergleam Sanctuary as well, and proposes that you travel there together. If you agree to take Maurice along, he will get angry when you use Nettlebane to clear a path to the tree. Then he insists that you do not take the sap because that would harm the tree. You can then ask him what he proposes be done about the Gildergreen in Whiterun, since it needs the sap to heal. Maurice ponders this for a minute, then prays to Kynareth at the base of the tree. And sure enough, Kynareth sends a sapling. Then Maurice has this to say.
The Eldergleam has blessed us with a sapling. You should take it to Whiterun. Danica will want to see that the true blessings of nature lie in renewal, not a slavish maintenance.
After some reluctance, Danica will accept the sapling, thus completing the quest. Another thing to note here is that the Gildergreen has ended up in this sad state because it was struck by lightning. Nordic belief holds that lightning storms are the work of Kyne. So perhaps Kynareth/Kyne did this to the Gildergreen on purpose for some reason. Maybe she wanted to remind Danica that the beauty of nature is renewal. Or maybe she wanted us to solve the mystery of the Skyforge. Speaking of the Skyforge, what's important about this quest for our purposes? Well, that little bit of Maurice's dialogue is the key to understanding the Skyforge. So what is this long-kept secret about this big old forge that prompted me to do this video? The thing that adds a whole new layer to Bethesda's vision for just what this thing is. Let's summarize the key pieces one more time. What we're looking at here is a large statue of a bird perched on top of a forge, almost as if it's nesting. The forge has apparent magical properties. The companions use it to cremate people, and somehow the forge draws power from this. In fact, after Kodlak's funeral, it becomes capable of crafting ancient Nord armor and Nord hero gear. And Yorland tells the player that the forge feels young. We're fairly certain that whatever magic the Skyforge possesses has to do with Kyne, the goddess of nature, and the true blessings of nature lie in renewal. At the beginning of this video, I asked you a question, but with those things in mind, I ask you again. What kind of bird is this? It is a phoenix. Think about it, it's a giant bird standing over a pile of ashes. A phoenix is a mythical bird that burns upon death and is reborn or renewed from its ashes. But this one isn't quite doing that. It's nesting here by overseeing the rebirth or renewal of the heroes that are cremated here into something new, something young. The Nord hero weapons that currently living heroes carry into battle. And yes, that's where the name for Nord hero gear comes from. So that's Bethesda's vision here. The idea is that this is a symbolically nesting phoenix that renews some aspect of the people that are cremated here. Some might say, wait, there's no phoenixes in Elder Scrolls. But remember, what we're reading into here is Bethesda's intentions as artists. So in this case, they're relying on our external understanding of what a phoenix is from other fantasy works. Also, there's another possible hint supporting this vision for the Skyforge in ancient Nordic ruins. Halls of Stories contain these carvings representing deceased Nords being brought to each of the gods. Let's take a look at Kyne's carving. They're literally taking their dead to the bird, and there's these burning doodads here. I think these little things represent souls, and burning them represents the renewal process of the Skyforge. So who built the Skyforge? Well, I don't think it was built per se. I think at one time this was a real giant bird. The ancient Nords believed that certain animals were avatars of the gods, and Kyne's avatar is a large bird. Hence, I believe this was at one time an avatar of Kyne. After all, an avatar of a god turning into a stone monument is something that we've seen in the games before. Perhaps this is the form that she took when she fought in the War of Manifest Metaphors, which would further explain why the Snow Elves feared it so much. So yeah, I don't think that the Phoenix was ever built. However, I do think that the Forge part of it was added by the Companions. Let's take another look at Songs of the Return Volume 7. It says that the eyes and beak were opened in flame, but it doesn't say anything about there being fire at its feet. So, the Companions probably added the Forge part of it in order to better tap into whatever magics Kyne left behind here. At some point, they must have realized that the Phoenix had magical potential, so they turned it into something that they understood how to use, much like what tonal architects do. Now let's see if we can figure out why the eyes glow at night. Well, they don't glow at night exactly, do they? They start glowing this orange color around dusk and turn yellow around 9 p.m. They stay yellow all night, then around 5 a.m. they start to gradually turn orange again until daytime when the glowing just stops. So if it doesn't correspond exactly to nighttime, what does it correspond to? Well, I think they glow during this time because the moons are close by. Does that sound like something else we've discussed about the moons? Well, yes, it's much like weapons with the Silent Moon's enchantment. I looked into this further, and long story short, the enchantment actually doesn't function perfectly. But guess what? Apparently, it's supposed to deal the extra damage between the hours of 9 p.m. and 5 a.m., which is also when the Phoenix's eyes are at their most yellow. Hence, I think that the glowing eyes symbolize Kyne's love for sure, which is why they glow when his remains are close by, thus the similarities to the Silent Moon's enchantment. So those are my thoughts about the Skyforge. However, I have something else to share with you all. One of the things that I love about doing mystery videos is that when I'm doing the research for them, I frequently end up discovering things that aren't immediately related to what the video is about. And this time around, I believe that I have uncovered something huge. In my research for this video, I ended up in a very gray area of Elder Scrolls lore, and I made many observations. Eventually, I ended up with a theory that if correct has huge implications on the Elder Scrolls universe. So I took so long to get this video out because I wrote the script for the next one as well, so that you won't have to sit on that cliffhanger for too long. So I'm going to get right to work on the next video. And if you consider yourself an Elder Scrolls fan, I highly recommend that you check it out. That concludes this video. We just answered the age-old question, who built the Skyforge and why. We talked in detail about just what this thing is and Bethesda's vision behind it, and we had ourselves a lot of fun. Please like, subscribe, and share, and I will see you next time.